This happened about 3 years ago when I was 24. At the time, I was living in a cramped apartment in Richmond, Virginia, working a data entry job that was honestly pretty soul-crushing. I spent 8 hours a day staring at spreadsheets, and by the time Friday rolled around, I usually felt like I was losing my mind. I needed a break, not a staycation, but a getaway from every living soul type of break. I decided to head into the Appalachian Mountains to a spot I'd seen on a hiking forum. I'm a big photography hobbyist, and I'd recently picked up a new Nikon and a high-end trail camera. My plan was simple: hike deep enough to find some decent wildlife and maybe get some clear shots of the stars. I packed my gear, grabbed some freeze-dried meals, and started the 5-mile trek into the tree line. The hike was rewarding. I found a nice, flat clearing near a cluster of old-growth oaks. I spent the afternoon setting up my tent and, more importantly, mounting my trail camera. That night was uneventful. I made my dinner, read a bit by my lantern, and turned in around 10 p.m. I remember sleeping unusually heavily, which was weird because usually I'm a very light sleeper when I'm out in the woods. I didn't hear a single thing, not even a twig snap. When I woke up the next morning, things felt fine. I had my coffee, unzipped the tent, and walked over to the oak tree to check the trail camera. I popped the SD card into my laptop and started scrolling through the captures. The first few photos were just what I expected. The wind blowing through the grass at 1 a.m. And then things went from a 5 to a 10 dot at 2:14 a.m. The motion sensor had triggered. In the frame, standing just at the edge of the dying embers of my fire, was a man. He was wearing a dirty high-visibility vest, and he was just standing there, perfectly still. He didn't have a flashlight or any gear. Just him looking at my tent. I clicked to the next photo. 2:20 a.m. He had moved 10 feet closer. He was staring directly at the mesh window of my tent. In the photo at 2:35 a.m., he was standing right over my gear, looking down at my boots. But it was the very last photo that made my stomach turn. It was time-stamped 3:02 a.m. In this shot, the man was crouched down on his haunches, his face literally inches away from the mesh window of my tent. He was looking inside, watching me sleep. I didn't even pack. I grabbed my laptop and my Nikon, left the tent and the expensive trail camera behind, and bolted. I ran the full 5 miles back to my truck without looking over my shoulder once. When I got to the sheriff's office, they were sympathetic, but they basically told me that since he didn't technically do anything, there wasn't a crime to report. I still had that SD card. Sometimes I look at that last photo and wonder if I had woken up and unzipped that mesh, would I have been looking right into his eyes? Back in 2019, me and my two closest buddies, Tyler and Marcus, headed out to Joshua Tree for a long weekend. Tyler had just gotten a big promotion, so we decided to go all out. We weren't doing the broke college student thing this time. We brought expensive ribeye steaks, 2 cases of beer, and a high-end charcoal grill. We were all pretty experienced outdoorsmen, and I even brought my Smith & Wesson for protection. You don't go into the desert without some kind of guardian instinct taking over, especially when you're miles from the nearest paved road. We found a spot deep in the park, far from the main tourist loops. It was perfect, huge rock formations blocking the wind and a clear view of the desert floor. We spent the night laughing and watching the stars. By midnight, we were exhausted. We retreated to our separate tents, which we'd pitched in a loose cluster about 15 feet apart. I'm usually a heavy sleeper, but at exactly 4:12 a.m., I woke up. I froze in the dark and listened, and then I heard it. A faint, rhythmic clinking sound. Clink, clink, clink. It was metal hitting metal, but it was muffled, like someone was trying to be as quiet as possible. I figured it was just Marcus messing with his gear, so I just pulled my sleeping bag tighter and drifted back off. It was a mistake I still regret. When the sun rose, I was woken up by Tyler letting out a genuine scream. I unzipped my tent and scrambled out, reaching for my sidearm. Tyler was standing by my tent, his face completely pale. He was pointing at the ground right next to where my head had been resting. Driven deep into the hard, sun-baked desert earth was a heavy-duty 12-inch steel tent stake. It hadn't been there when we went to sleep. It was driven perfectly straight, barely 2 inches from my temple. We looked around, but nothing else had been touched. Our stakes were still in the cooler, and our wallets were in our tents. Whoever had been there didn't want our stuff. They had spent several minutes in the middle of the night, crouched over me in the dark, slowly and silently hammering a metal spike into the ground inches from my skull. The stake was driven so deep we couldn't even pull it out. It was like a permanent marker of how close I'd come to something terrible. We packed up in under 5 minutes. It felt like an eternity. As we were driving out, I looked back at the campsite and saw a blue sedan parked on a ridge about a quarter-mile away. A man was standing next to it, just watching us leave. He didn't wave, he didn't move. I still think about that clink, clink, clink sound. I realized later they must have been using a rubber mallet to keep me from waking up. I was 26 and living in Seattle when I went through a pretty rough breakup. To clear my head, I drove out to the Olympic National Forest for a solo trip. I'm a bit of a gearhead, so I always carry a hand crank emergency radio to check the weather and local frequencies. I found a secluded spot about 3 miles off a logging road and set up camp. On my second night, I was sitting by the fire, slowly cranking the radio to find a weather report. The forest was dead silent, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched. As I scanned the frequencies, I hit a patch of static that slowly cleared into a human voice. It was a man, and he was whispering. I leaned in thinking it was some weird local broadcast, until I heard him say, "He's putting another log on the fire now." I froze. My guardian instinct kicked in immediately. I reached for my gear and looked into the dark tree line, but my fire was making it impossible to see past the first few rows of trees. The voice on the radio immediately whispered, "He's looking for me. He's reaching for the orange canister." My hands started shaking so hard I almost dropped the radio. I realized someone was watching me from the darkness with a transmitter, narrating my life in real time. It wasn't a ghost. It was a person with a radio, sitting somewhere in the pitch black, just feet away from my sight. I didn't even bother dousing the fire. I just bolted for my truck, leaving my expensive tent behind. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just drove the 3 hours back to Seattle in complete silence. I threw that radio into a dumpster the next morning. What freaks me out the most isn't just that someone was watching me. It is that they wanted me to know they were watching. Like that dead squirrel I've heard about in other stories, it was a message. A message that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I haven't been back to that part of the forest since, and I don't think I ever will.